In Amy Coney Barrett's opening statements in her Senate Judiciary hearing, she claimed that Justice Antonio Scalia and his constitutional interpretation framework called Originalism were great sources of inspiration to her. Here I'm going to demonstrate that Originalism is utter garbage, and anyone who utilizes it is unfit to sit on the Supreme Court. I'm going to do this by analogously comparing the Ten Commandments from the Jewish tradition and the U.S. Constitution. So, in that cultural context, Moses goes up on the mountain, Yahweh speaks to Moses, issuing the Ten Commandments, and Moses is merely a scribe. Likewise with the Constitution, Constitutional Convention is held over an extended period of time, and Jacob Challis pens the final result of the Constitutional Convention. So let's look at Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, which states, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a year of term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. This is known as the 3/5 clause and also the 3/5 compromise. So slaves, for example, counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress and for the purposes of taxation. Compare this analogously to the Eighth Commandment. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Okay. So in the Socratic dialogue known as the Euthyphro, Socrates proposes a dilemma to Euthyphro that is now referred to as Euthyphro's Dilemma regarding divine command theory. Socrates asks Euthyphro, is an action right because God wills it, or does God will the action because it is right? So analogously, applying that to our examples, is the 3/5 clause right because the framers willed it, or did the framers will the 3/5 clause because it is right? Is the Eighth Commandment right because Yahweh willed it, or does Yahweh will the Eighth Commandment because it is right? The first form of the dilemma entails that rightness is arbitrary. Yahweh could will anything, and it's right. Likewise, the framers could will anything, and it is right. Yahweh and the framers could have willed differently, and that difference would be right. So rightness flows from the will of the one issuing the norms. And the one issuing the norms could will whatever. So this was almost the case with states' representation in Congress. The framers hotly debated representation by the states in Congress for an extended period of time. The end result is equal representation in the Senate and proportional representation based upon population in the House with the 3/5 compromise. So the framers almost willed differently. The second horn entails rightness is independent of the lawgiver, norm giver, etc. Yahweh is merely a messenger to Moses, and the framers are the messenger to Jacob Challis. So determining rightness can be done by appealing to the reasons supporting the rule, norm, law, etc. So the Eighth Commandment, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, is right because without such a norm, no one in society can enjoy safety and security. Nearly every culture throughout history enacts norms nearly identical to the Ten Commandments, because without these norms, society itself falls apart. So the reasons behind it are what make it right. There cannot even be a society without norms such as the Ten Commandments. But originalism asserts the first horn of the dilemma is the correct solution and interprets the Constitution in that light. So originalists such as Antonio Scalia say things like the original meaning and fixed meaning in the original application. So, and this is where it's very interesting looking at the history of just Antonio Scalia. So amendments, for example, we have amendments not because the current framers, which are us today, will differently, but because the original framers are wrong. The reasons behind it were in error. They were wrong about their reasons. Not because we as a society now, in the future, are just willing differently and we're just as arbitrary as they were back then, as the framers were in the 18th century. So it's interesting that Scalia blatantly contradicts himself regarding the Second Amendment, which is the only amendment with its own preamble. And Scalia claimed that you did not need that preamble to interpret the Second and apply the Second Amendment. But the Second Amendment actually, the preamble to the Second Amendment actually supports the second horn of Euclids Dilemma because it lays out the reasons behind the Second Amendment. So Scalia has to reject the preamble in order to support the first horn of the dilemma, that just whatever is willed is what's right. Okay? And it's also interesting to note that Scalia would have sided with an open racist, Judge Harlan, in Brown versus Board of Education, where Scalia claims that the Equal Protection Clause does not apply to education. So if you want to accept originalism, then you're openly claiming that rightness, that the laws and norms of society are arbitrary. They're based on whatever people happen to will at the time. That there is no reason, rationality behind the laws of our Constitution. We can be wrong. We're fallacious. We make errors in reasoning all the time. But we can correct ourselves. And that's why we have amendments. That's why we have amendments such as the 15th and 19th Amendment, because the original framers were wrong about who has the right to vote. Not because we decided later to will differently. And we're just as arbitrary now as they were then. They were wrong. We corrected ourselves. Under originalism, there is no self-correction. There's merely arbitrary willing differently. It's interesting that Scalia and Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Antonio Scalia and Amy Coney Barrett, are conservative theists. So as like a future investigative question, how many proponents of originalism are conservative theists? It's also interesting that they're both Catholic, and Amy Coney Barrett's version of Catholicism is arguably heretical. But that's a different point and not part of this argument. It's also interesting that they're both Catholic, but the magisterium rejects divine command theory. But yet, in originalism, they are divine command theorists. It's just, instead of a deity, it's the framers, by analogy. And they're asserting arbitrariness as the basis for constitutionality, rather than reasons, rationality as the basis. So anyone who asserts originalism is not fit to sit on the Supreme Court.